Hello, my name is Kate Guthrie Caruso, and I'm here today to give you a lecture on the graphic novel as literature, an overview and the literary elements that we see frequently in the graphic novel. I will be quoting from certain scholars throughout this. If the direct link is not provided, I do have recommended readings at the end, and that is where those quotes are coming from. Please join me for the next couple of minutes while I go over this for you. All right, so to begin, to talk about the graphic novel, we first really need to define what the novel is, and I think the best way to do that is to give some quotes from prominent writers and how they have defined the novel. So first, Grace Pally says that the job of the writer is to illuminate what is hidden, and this ties into the novel because essentially that is what the novel is trying to do. Laurie Moore says that a short story is a love affair, a novel is a marriage, a short story is a photograph, a novel is a film. I particularly like this quote because it ties into some of the image qualities that we find in graphic novel as well. All right. Also, Ian Forster says that the fundamental aspect of the novel is its storytelling aspect. Without the storytelling, of course, we're not going to stay interested and the novel will fail. Finally, and my all-time favorite quote, is by Jane Austen. And what she says is that it is only a novel, or in short, only some work in which the greatest powers of the mind are displayed, in which the most thorough knowledge of human nature, the happiest delineation of its varieties, the liveliest effusions of wit and humor are conveyed to the world in the best chosen language. Now, of course, the graphic novel then takes language in a different direction because we have to interpret both actual written language and a visual language that we become immersed in as we read. So we then need to ask ourselves, what is the graphic novel? So the graphic novel combines together the aspects and elements of both the graphic and the novel. So in American and British use of the word graphic novel, it is text that combines that written text and images to tell a complete story in book form. So Christopher Murray, who's an author of Champions of the Oppressed, Superhero Comics, Popular Culture, and Propaganda in America During World War II, says that the graphic novel is usually taken to mean a long comic narrative for a mature audience, published in hardback or paperback and sold in bookstores, with serious literary themes and sophisticated artwork. So the graphic novel, in his argumentation, is taking a comic a step further into that mature audience, and then the serious literary themes and that sophisticated artwork all have to play a role in order to get that title. So the graphic novel and comics then take on a full another meaning, okay? This is a contentious definition. Many scholars are at odds right now about whether we should call all comics just comics or if the graphic novel should be applied. And the reason that they came up with the term graphic novel really is because the term comic often refers to the short, often standalone comics, or periodical comics, meaning that they are published in periodicals, so they may be published weekly or monthly, but they come in different series and often can stand alone by themselves as well. Whereas that graphic novel then is a complete text that's in a longer book form. Okay, the term comic has developed some negative connotations within our society as well, and part of that is because of the roots of the comic. We will discuss the history of comics and the graphic novel in a moment, but in general, when we say comic, there's a stereotype that the readers are often juvenile or they are subliterate, or both, and so the graphic novel, the term, really came out of a movement to try and make comics more serious and gear them towards a more adult audience. The term graphic novel is an attempt then to elevate that subset of the comic form, meaning the book length comics and what they're geared towards, adults and mature content, to the level of literature worthy of study. All right. So graphic novels, or sequential art, as Will Eisner termed that word, and we'll talk about sequential art in a minute, are juxtaposed pictorial and other images in a deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or produce an aesthetic response. So in addition to having a written narrative, the graphic novel then have that deliberate sequence, and what that sequence means makes a difference in how we interpret the text. Okay. Christopher Murray then says that the defining attribute of each was a formal control of the medium, which is to say a highly sophisticated degree of control over the use of panel transitions, layout, and so on to achieve certain narrative effects, coupled with artistic innovation and a literary quality in which the authors announce their individual style. So what he means by panel transitions, in a graphic novel or in a comic, we get illustrations in boxes that then go in sequence. So those are called panels. Okay, and between those panels and how they transition between each other and the layout of each page within the graphic novel create certain narrative effects that then work to create an overall comprehensive narrative. But that's not all that exists. We also have the artistic innovation. So the artwork itself matters just as much as the written text in a graphic novel. And what Murray is arguing is that in order to be a graphic novel, it must have a literary quality. Okay, so Will Eisner, we're going to hear a lot from. This is a cover from one of his famous graphic novels, or sequential art books, as he termed the word. So let's go ahead and look at another quote from him. Okay, so Will Eisner says that the future of this form, meaning the graphic novel, awaits its participants who truly believe that the application of sequential art, with its interweaving of worlds and pictures, could provide a dimension of communication that contributes, hopefully on a level never before attained, to the body of literature that concerns itself with the examination of human experience. Okay, so by creating sequential art, what they are doing, or what graphic novels are trying to do, is to tell us something about that human experience. Okay, so in order to understand the graphic novel, we need to know about where it's come from and its roots. And really, it begins with comics. Okay, the term comics actually first showed up from the late 19th and early 20th century newspapers when they had funny pages. Okay, there were definitely, arguably, comics before that, but they weren't termed that. All right, and so this is an example. It's not a great picture, but this is actually from 1893, and it was published in a British journal, Punch, in Britain, and it's not sequential. It starts out, it's just in one scene, and we get just a joke within that panel. Okay, so I'm going to read to you what the caption says, because I don't think you can see it. And it basically says, the one woman on the left says, "So, you and George have been staying with my dear old friends, Sir Isaac and Lady Lincresta Walton. Didn't you find them very nice to you?" And then the other woman says, and this is the punchline, "Yes, especially when we were leaving." Okay. Of course, these are already comments on the culture, and people were consuming these. By the 1930s, comic books actually started to be published. This is really where we see the rise of Marvel Comics, for instance, and they really start to take root in society. These were geared mostly at young adults and children, and they were generally sold in newsstands. They were not making their way into bookstores yet. All right, so then in the 1960s, we actually see a counter movement to this idea of the comic, and they became termed comex, with an X at the end. This was a movement that associated X-rated content and taboo content into the comic culture. These were underground comics, and they created a counterculture movement. Authors such as R. Crumb really were the most famous and the leaders of these. This is actually a page from one of Crumb's pieces. But they were considered so taboo that they did not make it into bookstores either. Instead, they were sold in head shops. So these are stores that primarily sold marijuana pipes or other drug paraphernalia. And so they were being consumed in some ways like the way we consume pornography today. They were considered very controversial. So by the 1970s, we started to see academics take an interest in the comic culture. And specifically, they were interested in that counterculture and making a study of it. So Crumb was a very large focus within academia. Other writers such as Winsor McCay and George Harriman, all three are comic strip creators from the early 20th century, were investigated and wrote about in the academic sphere. So this is the first time we actually see comics really being considered something worthy of study. Academics also tried to give legitimacy to comics by looking at the history of visual representation within our cultures. So they looked at cave paintings, hieroglyphics, illuminated manuscripts, and broadsheets, as well as many other things, to say that these were the precursors of what inspired comics, because they were making comments about culture. By 1985, Will Eisner actually used the term sequential art to define his own work. And so this came as a precursor term before we get the graphic novel. So at first, comics were being defined as art, and then the novel aspect came in a little bit later. So sequential art was really designed to, again, move away from that younger comic stereotype, and was geared towards adult and serious themed comics. All right, so once academia kind of took hold, many American comic publishers started to grasp the concept that adult-themed comics could be really beneficial to them. It could make them money. And so they started to create more and more violent comics, as well as more intellectual comics that were geared more towards that adult audience. These were generally published as books or albums. And this is when we started to see the move from selling comics in just newsstands or in those head shops to the comic book shops that we know today. In the 1970s, the term graphic novel really began to take root. And while it's pretty much impossible to figure out what was the first graphic novel, Eisner is really attributed as pioneering this way. So even though he defined it as sequential art at one point, he also is considered to be the pioneer of that graphic novel. His A Contract with God and Other Tenement Stories was particularly famous and considered to be one of the most important first graphic novels. Okay. Then in the mid to late 1980s, the graphic novel and adult comics really started to take hold. And we started to see ones that were inspired by previous comics and were taking up those themes. So for instance, Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns was inspired by previous themes, but he took it into an adult concept. Alan Moore's Watchmen as well. It's a very bloody and violent text, as well as quite intellectual, and so it becomes ones that we want to investigate. However, both of these are giving nods to the previous comics because they're both rooted in that superhero genre that we were seeing in the 1930s really take hold. We also saw Mouse in 1980-86 by Art Spiegelman. It was published a little bit later, and with Mouse, or Spiegelman was highly influenced by that comics movement, and so Crumb played a large role in Spiegelman's creation of Mouse. Mouse also became one of the most important graphic novels because it is the first one to win the Pulitzer Prize in 1992. So as we move forward in time, we're starting to see graphic novels getting more and more respect in the academic community, but also in the general reading public community. So the 21st century in general, we've seen a widespread recognition for graphic novel as literature and art. Graphic novels are now being taught in schools across the country. They're also winning awards. The Pulitzer Prize, of course, is one, but there are multiple awards that extend outside just the comic fan community. So Christopher Murray says that graphic novels, have achieved something comparable to the complexity and density that can be achieved in a novel, while transcending the novel format's limitations with artwork that is an integral part of the medium rather than merely being illustrative of the plot. So we have in the past seen novels that use artwork. Of course, we have the artwork on the cover, but we've also seen wood cuttings or other sorts of illustrations that happen within novels. But generally what those images do is they just are conveying what the text has already said. They're re-emphasizing the plot. However, with the graphic novel, what we see is that the text and the image have to work in tandem in order to create the narrative story and the meaning. All right, so Art Spiegelman's Mouse, I just thought I'd throw in a picture here because it is so highly influential. And frankly, Mouse is considered to be one of the pioneers of the graphic novel, not just as a genre, but as literature itself as well as art. All right, so one of the first things we have to consider, of course, is the narrative in the graphic novel. So Eisner says that this was in his book, Narrative and Graphic Storytelling, he wrote that the story is the most critical component in a comic, the intellectual framework on which all artwork rests. Okay, so again, we're seeing that combination of text and plot to create story. Okay, so we see the written text and then we see the visual text, and that is what drives that intellectual frame. Okay, in the graphic novel, in order to create narrative, of course, we're combining that text and the picture equally in order to drive the narrative. So what I mean by this, John Thompson, again he's cited at the end, says that in the successful graphic novel, words and images should be on equal planes. One should not be privileged over the other. One cannot ask of a graphic novel which is more important, the words or the pictures, as both the domains combine together to form an inseparable text. This is very important. In a novel, a traditional novel, the text is always going to be where that meaning is emphasized. And so the images are just supplements. However, in a graphic novel, you cannot figure out the meaning or the importance of what the author is trying to say if you don't look at both the text and the image. All right, so finally, when we think about narrative in the graphic novel, Paul Ricoeur, who's a philosopher, states that the meaning or the significance of a story wells up from the intersection of the world of text and the world of the reader, creating a fictitious universe of the world, and reading becomes synonymous with living in the imaginary mode of existence. Okay, so the graphic novel, just like a novel, is attempting to create this intersection. Okay, and then finally, because comics are rooted in humor, that's really where their past comes from, the graphic novel is primed for parody and satire as a way to critique the culture or society they are addressing. Of course, some graphic novels take different approaches, and as we see the rise of the graphic novel becoming, as we see graphic novels becoming more and more important, many of them have moved away from humor and are using violence or seriousness. But we'll frequently find parody or satire that's emphasized both in the text and in the images themselves. All right, so one of the elements, besides narrative, that we have to think about in the graphic novel is the time and sequencing. Without considering this, we are missing a major piece of the graphic novel. So in the graphic novel, the past, the present, and the future are all available at the same time. The audience can drift back and forth in time through the images that are available. Okay, so to go into more depth, McLeod says in Sequential Art, the past is more than just memories for the audience, and the future is more than just possibilities. Both past and future are real and visible all around us. Wherever your eyes are focused, that's now. But at the same time, your eyes take in the surrounding landscape of past and future. So what he means by this is when we actually look at a graphic novel, we're given all of these panels or boxes that have the narrative and the images, and we are bouncing back and forth with our eyes through time. So it's all provided to us at once. Instead of when we're reading, we have to read exactly what's happening in the now. The same is true when we watch a movie. We're only seeing what is being shown to us at that moment. Okay, the graphic novel essentially is creating multiple times at the same time because of how we can view that. All right, so this is a couple of panels from Will Eisner's Storm Flashback, and what you'll see is there are three real panels here, and of course they are in a sequence. So Eisner designates comics as a sequential art, okay, meaning or referring mainly to the artist's task of arranging the sequence of events or pictures so as to bridge the gaps in action. Okay, so we can't have one continuous movement like we would see in a movie. Instead, we get a moment, a moment, a moment, and then how they interact with each other. So let's go into this a little bit further. Okay, so because of the way that a graphic novel is organized and sequenced, we experience time as both a moment when we look at just one panel and a continuous stream of moments as our eyes bounce around. Okay, in each panel, readers experience fractions of continuous moments. We never get a continuous stream in a comic. Okay, like I said, in a movie, we get that time flowing seamlessly. Whereas in the comic, it's a moment, a moment, a moment, and those combined together create that sequence. Okay, so because of that, the reader then becomes a participant in the meaning of time. What I mean by this is best said by Mick Luhan, and what he says is the comic book provides very little data about any particular moment in time or aspect in space of an object. The viewer or reader, okay, he's defining them as both, is compelled to participate in completing and interpreting the few hints provided by the bounding lines. So in essence, what we are doing is in each panel we're given those moments, and then it is up to us as a reader to participate, to connect all of those together and interpret their meaning. All right. So finally, John Thompson quotes Paul Ricoeur, the philosopher that I mentioned earlier, and he says that Paul Ricoeur writes that two kinds of time are found in every story told. On the one hand, a discrete, open, and theoretically undefined succession of events. One cannot always ask, and then, and then. And then on the other hand, the story told presents another temporal aspect characterized by the integration, the culmination, and the ending in virtue of which a story gains an outline. Graphic novels convey both the linear and the narrative formations of time through the sequential art that is unique to the comic book format. Okay, so those two aspects of time get merged together within the comic book format. So, of course, because the graphic novel includes images, we have to look at them not just as art, but as symbolizing certain things, and as in correlation with the text creating the narrative. The images themselves cannot stand alone. The text itself cannot stand alone to create a comprehensive meaning. So, graphic symbolism is the practice of representing a concept, object, activity, place, or event by forms of graphic representation, be they typographic, photographic, or illustrative. So, of course, graphic novels generally are using illustrative graphic symbolism. And so that concept, object, activity, place, or event is represented via the illustration. The picture then represents a word, idea, or the theme of a text. So these images then work in tandem with the written narrative to drive meaning in graphic novels. They often emphasize or symbolize concepts that are not expressed in the writing. Okay, they're supported by the writing, but without the image, we won't be able to get the symbolism. So I want to give an example from Mouse. These are two panels from Mouse. First off, because we've talked about sequentialing, the sequence of panels, it's important to note in this one that we have two panels that are overlapping. One is overlapping the other, and they represent different times. Okay, so these are both taking place in the past tense. Mouse is a story where a son goes and talks to his father, and then his father recounts his experience of the Holocaust. So he is expressing his experience right here. Okay, the Germans intended to make an example of them, and then the bottom text says, the next day I walked over to blank street, I apologize, I can't pronounce it, and I saw them, ... And then we get the image underneath that says they hanged there 1 full week. And so we get the retelling, and then we get the graphic representation of what actually happened. You'll also note in Mouse that the characters, in this case the Jewish people being represented, are drawn as mice. We will also see, if you actually read the text, that the Nazis are drawn as cats. So Art Spiegelman was doing this very purposefully, very symbolically, and he says that he realized that this cat-mouse metaphor of oppression could actually apply to my more immediate experience, meaning his family's experience of the Holocaust. Okay, so the cat-mouse is a metaphor, and it's a metaphor for oppression. All right, let's go ahead and move on. So the final thing I'm going to talk about is literary realism and interiority within graphic novel. So literary realism is essentially, it's a literary movement stressing the depiction of contemporary life and society as it exists or existed at the time of the text. Okay, and this gets narrowed down into an idea of formal realism. And formal realism, defined by Ian Watt, says the premise or primary convention that the novel is a full and authentic report of human experience. Now, of course, this ties back to our definition of the novel at the beginning, as well as many of the definitions of the graphic novel, that there is something inherent about a graphic novel that is telling us about that human experience, about our culture and society. Okay, so then interiority in literature relates to that interior, the mind, or the spiritual aspects of the characters. So, when we see these combined, okay, the graphic novel often does this. They merge literary realism and interiority through the written word and the artwork they provide. Junichiro Tanizaki states this very interestingly. What is said is, realism as what one might see out there in the world can be compared with the thoughts, desires, and always partial understandings of the interior mind. What goes on in the world compared with what we project onto it. We can think perhaps of art as balanced on this border between the exterior and the interior. Okay, so when we think of the graphic novel as art, we are combining that literary realism as well as the interiority, and seeing how they work in juxtaposition to them, to each other, and how they combine together. So, to review, we discussed the following points. We defined the graphic novel and why it is important to define it. We went over a brief history of comics and the rise of the graphic novel to help us to understand what the graphic novel's influences are, as well as why it has taken the trajectory it has. And then we discussed the elements of narrative, time and sequencing, image and symbolism, and literary realism and interiority apparent in the graphic novel. These are all elements that help to make the graphic novel considered literature and launch many graphic novels into our literary canon. So finally, think about, when you read a graphic novel, how these elements help to create literature or literary aspects of a graphic novel, and why we should consider the graphic novel being worthy of academic study. So here are our 3 recommended readings. There are so many written on the subject, but these are a great starting place if you are new to the graphic novel. The graphic novel by John Thompson, coming out of the University of Chicago. The graphic novel by Christopher Murray. This is actually a Britannica post. However, it gives a great overview of the graphic novel and the history, and how the graphic novel has made its way into the literary canon, by Sierra Thrope. This one looks at a graphic novel that we didn't even talk about, but she has some very interesting ideas about that literary canon. Thank you for joining me. My name is Kate Guthrie Caruso. I am a writer, instructor of literature, rhetoric and composition, and creative writing. Please contact me if you have any questions or comments.